Salam, Sanbonani, Molweni, Namaste, Vanakkam, and welcome to this episode of The People's Voice, produced and presented by your host, Shabna Mohammed for Salaamedia, your humanitarian journalism portal and platform. We're broadcasting live from Tigwini, Durban, KZN, South Africa. Welcome to the show. Our topic tonight, against a backdrop of rising racism, provoked xenophobia, corruption, and the desperate need for working class solidarity. We ask the questions: what does it mean to be Black? Who is an African? And what is the relevance of Black consciousness and Steve Biko in 2020? Before I introduce our brilliant guests, let's help you tune into a robust and critical conversation tonight, Sunday, the 25th of October. So you can comment, ask our guest questions, and share your ideas. Here's how we get connected. You can join us in one of about 10 ways on the Salaamedia Facebook page, Salaamedia YouTube, Twitter, or Instagram. You can listen live via the Salaamedia website or SoundCloud, and of course the Salaamedia or TuneIn app, and all free-to-air decoders. Fantastic. Got to love the technology. So the first thing I'm going to do is start a watch party, which I would really encourage you to do as well. You go to the Salaamedia page, look for the video tonight, which is playing live already, and you share it as a watch party. You just go start, watch party, and that's it. Your watch party will begin, and everyone who's on your networks will be able to join this very important conversation this evening. All right, let's welcome our esteemed guests into studio so that we may introduce them. Sadiq. Fantastic, and that's everyone. Professor Saths Cooper, Dr. Mamphela, Ramphele, Eugene, Skeef, and Nirvanen, Nyameko, Moodley. Welcome to the People's Voice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What an honor to have you all together. Let's do the introductions. Really important for those who don't know who these people are. It would be rather strange, but of course, context is always important. Professor Saths Cooper, banned and house arrested with Steve Biko and other founders of the Black Consciousness Movement in February 1973. First accused in the Sasso BPC trial, jailed for 9 years, including 5 in the same Robben Island style as former President Nelson Mandela. President of the Pan-African Psychology Union, past president of the International Union of Psychological Science, extraordinary professor, University of Pretoria, and honorary professor, University of Johannesburg. Welcome to the show. Dr. Mamphela Ramphele has a celebrated career as an activist, a medical doctor, an academic, a businesswoman, and a political thinker. She was a founder with Steve Biko of the Black Consciousness Movement. In 1976, she was detained under the Terrorism Act, and from 1977 to 1983, she was banned. Dr. Ramphele is the author of several books and publications on socioeconomic issues in South Africa. Wonderful. Eugene Skeef is a UK-based South African composer, poet, broadcaster, and educationalist who uses creativity as the core medium to deliver workshops and masterclasses. His skills are rooted in the combination of his experiences of working alongside the Steve Biko-led Black Consciousness Movement, as well as growing up in a family who cared about the vulnerable. Nirvanen Nyameko Moodley, an IT entrepreneur, promoting skills development through the CETA, served as CEO of SoftStart BTI IT Incubator, founding member of Africa 2.0, a Pan-African lobbyist organization, politically involved with Azasm, Azasco, and Azapo, gained political insights from his parents, Sam and Srini Moodley, founding members of the Black Consciousness Movement. I see we have a lot of interest in the show, lots of people joining in for this conversation, and it's about time that we have it. Let's start with the first talking point for this evening, and I want to start with a quote for context. In 1971, Sasso made more explicit that Black was defined as those who are by law or tradition politically, economically, and socially discriminated against as a group in the South African society and identifying themselves as a unit in the struggle towards the realization of aspirations. This translated into all those who did not qualify for the vote. As Biko put it, SASO is not a movement for Africans, not a movement for Indians, not a movement for colored people. It's a movement for people who are oppressed. And I'm quoting there from the Indian South Africans and the Black Consciousness Movement under Apartheid, Professor A.G. Desai. So here's the first question for our guests. Within the context of Black consciousness and racial polarization, what does it mean to be Black? Is Black a shade of skin? Is it your facial features, hair, culture, language, geography, ancestry, a state of mind, or solidarity against injustice? And I think we'll go in the order of the poster to simplify it. Professor Cooper, the mic moves to you.
Well, I think it is a little bit about our history. It is very clearly a state of mind. And towards that end, that definition was crafted in the early 1970s to unite all Black people. It is a feature of our current dispensation that we have removed the definition of Black from our constitution, where it was in the interim constitution, and it's been ensconced in the BBBE Act as a definer of who should be getting tender entry and that kind of thing. Now, it's significant that the population groups that we have on our statute books are the last formal vestiges of the apartheid system. Now, it's also important to tie that in with the majority party that was at the forefront of creating this democracy, the ANC, which uses as its symbol a wheel with 4 spokes. Now, all of us know that no wheel will survive with 4 spokes. You have to have 5 to survive, otherwise you'll collapse. And that's why we're seeing the collapse around us for people to get into who is Black on shade of color or hair and so on. We share the same biology, all of us, wherever we are. And we should be looking to create a common humanity. We should be looking to create a common nationality in this country. But we are rent asunder by our geographic name. One of 3 geographic names used in the world, all of them in Africa. The first one, South Africa, Central African Republic, and the last one, South Sudan. No other country calls itself by a geographic or compass point name. And that's part of our difficulty as a country. We're a nation struggling to be born, and under COVID, all of us seem to be caught up in who's Blacker than somebody else. And that is something that we should rid our minds of, we should rid our statute books of, and we appreciate that there are people out there who actually deserve the largesse of society. But in the way that our society has been run, particularly with the personalized and the politicized corruption, it's clear that nobody cares for the majority in this country. So, that excuse to say we want to affirm people, we want to redress, is just that. I mean, 2 weeks ago in the Western Cape, there was Glenn Snyman, who is renowned for opposing race classification. And what does he get charged with? Fraud and stuff like that, for claiming he was African, whereas they believe he's colored, like the old race classification board. The sooner we get short of race, the better.
up to a robust start there with Professor Saths Cooper's response to the question, what does it mean to be Black? Of course, it's a complex question. And I'm glad we spoke about Gail Snyman. Gail Snyman says, I'm African. The bureaucrats say, no, you're not. We'll tell you whether you're African or not. Dr. Mamphela Ramphele, within the context of Black consciousness and racial polarization, what does it mean to be Black?
You know, it's very sad that 26 years into our democracy, we're asking that question. It's the least important question. We are the only African country that's preoccupied with color, which is an expression of how deeply we have been indoctrinated into thinking that there is some value in color. We used Black solidarity to fight against white racism. But the idea was never to make the country a country that continues to be color-coded. Today, we should be talking about national consciousness. Because we know from science, there are no races. There is only one race, it's the human race. The idea of different races is a colonial construct to justify why white people treated us as nothing, the indigenous people of this continent and in other parts of the world. And so my appeal to South Africa is, please jettison this color coding and assume our human beingness. For God's sake, our ancestors, so many thousands, hundreds of thousands years ago, recognized that mutu ki mutu kababa, umtu ngabanye abantu. They didn't say a white person, a Black person, which is why we welcomed people who came as strangers, like the people who ended up colonizing us. We recognized them as human beings. We didn't recognize them as white people. And so my plea is South Africa, grow up and throw away this color coding. We do not need BEE to transform our inequities in the socio-economic arena. In fact, it is because of this BEE that we have embedded corruption in the very conduct of our governance system. It's very easy to find out who is poor in this country, who deserves the extra leg up. And so my plea to all of South Africans is, let's go back to African wisdom and just relate to people the way we want people to relate to us.
Absolutely.
If we embrace Ubuntu, our problems will be solved in a rational way.
Absolutely agree with you. Umuntu, Gumuntu, Gabantu, that's how we need to live our lives. Race is a tiny part of DNA. It doesn't mean we ignore people's identities, but our common humanity is going to help us overcome what is a very serious problem, and that is economic apartheid. Mr. Skeef, I can give you 2 minutes to respond to the same question within the context of Black consciousness and racial polarization. What does it mean to be Black?
Thank you. Firstly, I remember Steve Biko saying, Black consciousness is a means to an end and not an end in itself. Hereby, we were being educated to the purpose of our collective attainment towards a consciousness of freedom as a people on the receiving end of oppression. Black consciousness was saying to us that we need to love ourselves first and know that we are inherently equal to anyone else in the eyes of human creation. It was telling us that we are not the negative copy of another, but wholly ourselves in the positive affirmation of our being. So to be Black in that conceptual sense is ultimately arriving at the point where we are totally comfortable in our proverbial skin, and our newly cultivated sense of pride makes it no longer necessary to prove ourselves to anyone in terms of our color, if you like. We just continue to live in an equal society with a heightened awareness of this fundamental truth. So to be Black, in my view, is to embrace the deeper truth of who we are as we emerge from the consciousness of our Africanness, irrespective of our more recent biological heritage. So Blackness is expressed by Steve Biko and the rest of us who were active in the proliferation and dissemination of the Black consciousness movement during apartheid in South Africa, continue to be a state of consciousness at base. It is the product of an affirmative or positive manifestation of who we regard ourselves to be, as opposed to being called non-white, a demeaning notion of being the negative of someone else. However, all of this means that if it is true that, as Steve said, that Black consciousness was a means towards an end and not an end in itself, then really we should be getting deeper into just celebrating, as Mamphela and Saths said, the oneness of humanity, because there's one race, the human race. And I repeat, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. I am because you are. A person is a person through other people. So we need to wake up.
I love your response
to that.
I love your response because it highlights the consciousness part of Black consciousness so beautifully, you know, from a philosophical and existential level as well, that consciousness that makes us human. Thank you, Mr. Skeef. I want to turn the mic over to Nyameko now. Mr. Moodley, what does it mean to be Black?
Well, as a child growing up amongst these mighty minds, firstly, we have to honor them for creating such a philosophy, a belief system. It's the reaffirmation of self. And I was absolutely fortunate to have grown up with these thoughts that affirmed my humanity, and making sure that when I looked around in my world, I saw everyone as equal. I did not see a division between people, between sexes, and that it gave me the power and ability to rise above the oppression that we were placed within. And so that's what being Black is about. It is affirming oneself in this world, not by a color denomination, not by a racial description. Purely being Black has, as Biko says, is not a matter of pigmentation, but a mental state. And it's the equality of us all that needs to be harmonized. And so to bring the rest of us together in one collective last statement around this, Black is the affirmation of oneself. One cannot be looked upon or must not look down upon oneself. And that's what the Black consciousness gives and has given and will continue to give to everyone in the world. It's not just something that is exclusively a South African situation. It is a global address of ensuring that oppression does not exist. And it's the harmonization of the human being and equality of all.
Absolutely agree with you about the global relevance. I've tagged during my post for today's show activists from the Black Lives Matter movement, the Free Palestine movement, etc. And I hope that they're all tuned in. Your comments and questions for our guests are most welcome. Sianu Naidu says, are we discussing what it means to be Black or what it means to be African? Hang on for the next question, Sianu. That's coming up. And Andre D. Young RSA says, supposed to be African from what I recall. Go and ask Mr. Sneeman about that one. All right. Next question. I want to share with you as context the recent experience of a young man, a talented and humble arts graduate that I have the privilege of knowing. This is what he says. Around 8 p.m. last evening, we were stopped by 6 cops in a taxi and they asked to search us for documents. So we allowed them to search us. Upon them searching us and realizing that we were foreigners, they pushed us into the taxi and started beating us with a glass bottle. After that, they drove us to the top of Durban station, dragged us into a room at the top of the station and started slapping, kicking, and punching us. They would also bang our heads onto the wall and bang our heads against each other. They then wrapped tires around our heads, pushed us around, and strangled us. They said they wanted to teach foreigners a lesson. It happened about a week ago in Durban. So here's the question. How does Black consciousness respond to Afrophobia and xenophobia, which seems to be entrenched in our country, and yet there are those who are instigating it? And of course, are we African only if we're born in Africa, as Kwame Nkrumah said? Prof. Cooper.
Look, I think the best way to describe this craziness is that at the rendezvous, as Aimé Césaire mentions in his autobiography, the title of his autobiography, at the rendezvous of victory, at our rendezvous of victory, between April 24th and about the 10th of May, when I think Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as our founding president of our democracy, the leadership we had, I think, had missed what Mandela called the felt fire that ignited this country, this Black consciousness. And save for a few persons there in that cabinet, including Thabo Mbeki, Dalla Omar, and so on, most of them were caught up in the population registration categories. So effectively, at that rendezvous of victory, you had half human beings leading us forward. And that's why we have, as Mamphela correctly says, 26 years into democracy, we shouldn't even be discussing this. But under COVID, all our fault lines are coming out. And the fact that we did not transition effectively from a totalitarian system that apartheid ended up being and the laissez-faire democracy, we did 180 degrees and we did not deal with these essential questions. The result is all of these things are still with us and we get stupid, immature leaders standing up and claiming all sorts of things and disclaiming and canceling out others because of their own self-interest. Now, yes, we are African because of the continent, but as all of us have said thus far, and I want to reiterate that, we're human beings first. We've lost the battle about what do we call this country because everyone knows it as South Africa now. So I'm going to say, well, I'm South African, but I'm first a human being and then I'm South African. Then if I want to describe myself, I will describe myself as Black. But I'm part of the African continent. I don't belong in Europe or Asia or America. Those parts of the North, parts of the West, are a minority in the world and we're a majority. So calling ourselves anything else is meaningless. And I would like to point out that some 94 to 96% of the world's population can trace their DNA to the Komani San, that group that borders Namibia, South Africa, and Botswana, living in the southern Kalahari Desert. So if we're going to do that trace, we'll discover that. So there's more bringing us together than ought to divide us. And really, the categorizations, as my colleagues have pointed out earlier, who would want to categorize us, but those who want to oppress, exploit, exclude us. So an inclusive society should be looking at affirming, at enabling, and for crying out loud, all of us are people. We're human beings. Let us get used to that. Let us affirm that common humanity.
You are muted. You are muted.
For that, Dr. Nanda Subin says a colored teacher was charged for calling himself African in a job application. Absolutely. Let me turn the mic over to Dr. Ramphele now. Same question, Doc, and we can give you about a minute there because we need to catch up. How does Black consciousness respond to Afrophobia and xenophobia?
True consciousness, which is what Black consciousness was about, because the people who needed to address the existential crisis they faced were people who were categorized as Black and excluded. So the consciousness is about awareness of who one is. And that awareness, properly followed through, brings you to the point that as a human being, you are a very unique creature who can only survive in relation to other human beings. We're back to Ubuntu. But it is not just about relationships in superficiality. It is an intricate interdependency. Now, there is something cruelly ironic about a person who is an African being charged for daring to say he is an African. That tells you that the people doing the charging are unconscious of who they really are. They are simply Ottomans that are executing something which is totally nonsensical, because it is consciousness that liberates the best out of us. People like Saths and I and Wostrini and the Steves of this day, we could, because we were conscious of who we were, we could stand up to those powerful, brutal people and say, I am Black and I'm proud. I would say I'm Black, I'm a woman and I'm proud. And that means that into everything I do, I bring the fullness of who I am. That's what consciousness is about. Now, if we were to build this into our education system, as the LEAP school system is doing in this country, those children from the poorest townships, like Diepsloot, like Langa, those children are not lacking in self-confidence. They don't want to look like somebody else. They are very proud of who they are, but they are very respectful of what it means to be human. The issue of Afrophobia is the cruelest irony, and is a mark of how we are mentally enslaved here in South Africa, particularly people who didn't go through the experience of the Black consciousness. They are enslaved to date. And when you are enslaved, people who look like you become your enemies because you want to dominate somebody. Freedom is indivisible. And that's what consciousness is about.
Freedom is indivisible. Of course, the most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, right? I think we know that quote very well. Thesna Aston says we need to focus on educating about internalized racism between us. It's important to understand. Mr. Skeef, I mean, I've just shared a horrific incident in this young man's life that happened here in Durban. He's from the DRC. He's an undergraduate, humble, talented, has this experience where he was almost killed and they used tires, taking him back to apartheid in our country. And of course, it hasn't ended if this is the way we're able to treat human beings. So again, the question, how does Black consciousness respond to Afrophobia and xenophobia?
Black consciousness is a progressive activism that is founded on the principles of the inherent meaning of the word consciousness. And it's beautiful that we keep repeating it because it's central to this conversation. The dictionary meaning of the word is the state of being aware and responsive to one's surroundings. So we can't embrace Black consciousness without actively functioning within society in such a way as to engender the kind of environment that is conducive to equality, which means the eradication of all forms of prejudice. But furthermore, we need to remember that the other African nations protected us when some of us went into exile. They welcomed us with open arms. In all my travels, whenever I mention the name Steve Biko in the context of our history, I'm treated with effusive love. The term African, at its simplest, refers to those of us whose formative years were spent on the African continent. Our strongest period of formation as people belongs to our earliest years, when we are at our most receptive in terms of navigating our trajectory multiply in our families, communities, countries, and especially also in the natural environment. This is particularly significant when we talk about Africa, because traditionally, as we all know, our umbilical cords are buried in the earth, traditionally, and a tree planted over the spot, making us one with our environment, and thereby making it suicidal to wantonly chop down a tree. So as Africans, in my view, we are custodians of the sacred forest. Any serious deviation from this understanding renders us non-African. Having said that, someone can be born thousands of miles away from the African continent and have claim to being African through their ancestry and cultural ceremonial practices. However, my political view about this is that anyone with a deep loyalty to the cause of sustaining the progressive legacy of the mother continent is African. This view is founded on the fact that humans have always been migrating across the planet, and like migrating birds, we carry the seed of our roots in our stomachs and often release this seed in foreign territories where a plant grows in a turret of a ruined castle and proclaims its nationality as a flaming aloe like a flag in the blue skies that defy distance while celebrating the source. And finally, I'd like to mention that I find it interesting that the Zulu word for source and a type of African celebratory dance is isisuso. So the same word for source is the word for dancing in celebration, if you like, of our humanity. That's my feeling.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. And we can see why we've got this multiplicity of views on the show today. Nyameko, one of the things that was told to this young man during this incident of xenophobic police brutality is we're going to show you what South Africa is all about. How does Black consciousness respond to Afrophobia and xenophobia?
Well, firstly, Black consciousness is about unifying and liberating oneself from one's oppression. The fact that a policeman or a person of authority in this country has violated and removed the human rights from a guest, and we as Africans know that we host and respect our guests. And if we are unable to show that respect, that means we have not freed ourselves from our oppression. And it goes back to a very crazy notion of how we have come to formulate the so-called new South Africa. We were a country of 4 provinces. We are now 9 provinces. We are a country where effectively there was the race groups themselves are still defined. I mean, you're still saying a Black Indian. You're saying a Black African as a race group. You're not unifying us to saying if you're defining yourself as a race to be human. That's the sole and singular framework. But we do not attest to that just by our institutional behavior of how we have created our definitions for ourselves in this country right now. And it's crazy to think that behavior like this would not happen because we're not treating ourselves as equal. I mean, you have white, you have black Indian, black colored, black African. That in itself is division. It almost also at one level, white people are now not considering themselves African. Indian people, or so-called Indian, and I'd like to emphasize this emphasis, so-called white, so-called Indian, so-called colored, are not African. And that's the same thing what you've just seen with this teacher from the Western Cape as well. These are now systemic or systematic of what would come and how the powers of people who are placed to protect are abusing those levels. And that's how it's emanating throughout our society. And it is the role of the Black Consciousness Movement from its inception, from its birth, to inform the people of South Africa, of Azania, that we are one people. We are part of the human race. And that is the only way we need to ratify this oppression that exists amongst us today.
Well, one Azania, one nation, almost halfway through the show. And I think we've pretty much covered the next question, which was this, and I'll just repeat it for the context of our viewers. Desna Aston says, pride in ourselves as Africans can begin by reading people like Robert Sobukwe, etc. To quote Sam Moodley, in 1969-1970, we started to attend Saths conferences, and there was this big debate about who was black. You know, this is irrelevant now, whether coloreds and Indians were black enough to be black. And then we had to go by that definition. All people who were not white were black, 1. 2, it had nothing to do with the color of your skin. And 3, it had to do with people who were socially, physically, psychologically, and economically oppressed in this country. We had to take those definitions and had to master the fact that all people who were disadvantaged by law were black, but it had nothing to do with the color of one's skin. So the question is about that apartheid tick box system, which we've inherited and seems to be firmly ingrained even 26 years later, even in relevance to COVID. And it's contradictory to BC, as Trini Moodley said, right? The call for unity across racial boundaries in the way in which BC envisaged was revolutionary and not only came up against the state's attempts to divide, but also the manner in which the oppressed had traditionally organized. So do we maintain the system or not? I think all our panelists agree that we don't maintain the system. But what kind of system do we need? Let's answer that question. Do we have a system of tick boxes, either you're a person of color or you're white? Should it be Black African, Afro-Indian, Afro-Caucasian? Or is it more relevant and powerful to analyze and organize according to socioeconomic class? What are your thoughts, Prof. Cooper?
I want to just reiterate. I would call myself Azanian, but I'll give it up and say South African. I will say I'm part of the human race. There's no other race, and there's no need to describe myself in terms of anybody else's prescripts or constrainment, because they want to put us in boxes, and over the centuries, we have been allowing ourselves to be so put in those boxes. So we actually need to get out of those boxes, claim the true humanity, and then cherish the diversity. If all of us look like me, spoke like me, and walked and talked like me, it would be a boring world. Thank heaven we have a diversity of voices, we have the kinds of different beauties that we see, and that difference is only external. We should not continue to divide as our oppressors, as our colonizers, and as the narrative through coloniality has determined who we should be. Because they actually claim themselves, and they claim all systems. They claim science, for instance, when we know it didn't start there. So I think it's about time we gave up these external ascriptions, just call ourselves what we need to, and that is South African, and be proud of whatever religion, whatever language and ethnicity we have, but don't allow those to be obstacles.
Thank you for that, Prof. Cooper. Dr. Ramphele, what do we do with this tick box system? Do we just get rid of it, or do we need to reconfigure it according to socioeconomic class? What do we do with it? Your mic, Dr. Ramphele.
The issue is, what kind of society do we want to build? That's the question. The tick box society is not a society at all. We need to learn from nature. Nature teaches us that the greatest prosperity comes from an ecosystem of diversity and unity in that diversity, the sharing, the supporting, and the affirmation. And therefore, what we need to be focusing on in South Africa is, how do we build the kind of society which is characterized by unity in diversity, that celebrates the diversity of languages, diversity of cultures, but that is united in affirming human dignity and making sure that each and every child is supported to become the genius that they are brought up to be, or that they were born as. Now, our focus on tick boxes is exactly what has undermined our democracy since 1994. Look at how poor rural communities are being oppressed by officials in government who are in this for themselves. They will not treat people who don't look like them in the way that they treat their own people, with total disrespect. And you cannot disrespect someone who looks like you if you respect yourself. And I come back to the same thing, that the value of a consciousness movement is in raising the awareness that we have to free ourselves from the divide and rule of the past, from the focus on competing for what we think is a very limited resource pool, but working together, we create abundance. And this is how those of us who grew up in rural areas knew that is in sharing that abundance flows. And it is abundance that flows to each and every human being, because by affirming their humanity, you are affirming yours. By respecting others, you're respecting yourself. And that's how we should be bringing up our children. Our children don't need these tick boxes. They are an affront to who we are as a people.
Dr. Ramphele, we've got Nirvana Mahadev Subramani, who says, well said, Mam Ramphele. We've got Nade Bulbulia, who says, such an honor to be listening to this panel. Absolutely agree with you. Mr. Skeef, what do we do with these tick boxes? Do you think there is some sense in replacing it with a tick box system, or either you're part of the billionaire class or you're not?
Tick boxes, as we all know, are a residual rubbish of the colonial compartmentalization, sort of format. You know what I'm saying? So if I was given the task of creating, a society that worked more efficiently than the one we're talking about, the first thing I'd do is take those boxes and demolish them. I'm reminded in this thought by the fact that there are some people, there are some peoples within the African continent who are exceptionally good at making music, but they hardly talk about the music, because they're so busy making it, playing it. Their main focus is in the indulgence of this creative art form that they are supremely gifted at expressing themselves in. So they don't distantiate themselves to then scratch their head and think, what kind of box did Master tell us we could put this into, kind of thing, they carry on playing it. They play their music. So an outlook that focuses more on being who we truly are, and everybody having the opportunity to contribute to collectively defining ourselves, is a better society for me. Throw the boxes away and refashion them into other things if you like, but no tick boxes for me.
Interesting opinion coming there from Mr. Skeef. We've got a comment here from Stan Naidu. It's a bit of a long one, but let's summarize it. In my opinion, racial identity denialism is a dangerous pathway to follow, as by removing color coding, we deny our people the opportunity to present ourselves with all that makes them and what brought them here. We need to understand that you simply cannot become colorblind and wish away the experiences and contributions, positive or negative, that brought us here. I agree on the point that we should not disrespect someone by their color, but you need to understand that color classification has shaped entire generations, and to remove it, we need constructive consciousness programs to change. We cannot just drop it. I'm going to move the mic over to you, Nyameko, because next month it's 160 years since Indian slaves arrived in South Africa, right? So I think this point that Sieno is raising is extremely important for us to address. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, in terms of holding on to your historical past and making the virtues of where we come from in the colonial societies that affirmed itself over the last 300, 400 years of either slavery or indentured laboring formats that framed how people got to different places, though movement was natural prior to that. Firstly, I want to attest to this. Africa, we had no boundaries until the colonialists came here. We were one land. We were one people. And yes, by my distinction, by my history, part of my genealogy comes from India, but I am born in Africa. So I am African. So I attest to that first in my definition. By saying that you want to affirm the histories, this person that has commentated that we cannot discount them, it becomes a discussion that is actually, in my opinion, partly frivolous, because you're not seeing the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that we are one people. You want to sustain, this comment sustains division. We cannot sustain division. We can appreciate, as Mamphela and Saths and Eugene have said here, that we can celebrate our diversity, but the emphasis is our journey to unity, not keeping us in our pasts and holding us back to our divisional nature. We need to celebrate ourselves and see ourselves at a higher format of humanness, of the human society, not hold on to what culturally makes us because of either language, because of religious practices. These are in itself divisive, but more importantly, they need to be celebrated in their spaces. But the first thing that we must attest to, and we cannot move anymore forward if we do not affirm being human. And to the larger question at hand, and the initial question, the tick boxes, yes, throw them, burn them, get rid of it, in terms of our identities, especially in the global world. We now live in a global society. Our economies are of a global nature. It now even gives the Black consciousness a greater platform, because that's what we assimilate. We assimilate humans and humanness all the way through. And that's one people and one human race. Dividing us creates
Clear
problems.
response there from Nyameko. I foresee a constitutional court challenge coming up in respect of that tick box matter, and that'll be interesting. Let's talk about our political system now. To quote Fatima Mir, the constitution will have to change. We have to give more power to the people so they can be more involved electing their own leaders. You can't enter an election without some financial resources. Now, as things stand, parties are financed, but the people aren't. My assessment is that our constitution, which we boast so much about, is flawed to the extent that it gives power to the parties, not to the people. The people haven't achieved democracy in this country. Democracy has been achieved by the party. People nominate nobody. They cannot nominate their officials. They cannot nominate their leaders. The people remain powerless. Now, seen through the lens of Black consciousness, how should this elitist and engineered system, largely ineffective, of course, be transformed so that every person's voice is directly heard and is able to make decisions? Prof. Cooper.
Look, let's first acknowledge that the proportional representation system we had was a compact reached in 1993, 94 to enable the first elections to happen. The subsequent findings were completely negated, and it is true. Less than 0.001% of the population are responsible for appointing people out there. Because if you are in the parties, you determine what should happen. And that's why our Concord has, on the 11th of June this year, said that the system is flawed. I think that what we do need is we need some proportionality, but we should also ensure that the excellent, smart, bright people out there can stand for office, not merely be rejected in the way they are, because political parties say we have a local government system where you can elect your representatives, but I think most people don't even appreciate that. It's so bad because our education is so poor on it. We need to be able to elect, I think, our president. We should be able to elect our MPs. We should be able to elect local government councillors as well as mayors. The provinces, I think, are a colossal waste of time. It's jobs for pals. They don't enable us. And I think we should get rid of this government system that is top-heavy without delivery. If we have a leaner and meaner system where there's direct access to elected representatives, we will see change. Right now, those people who are sitting in all these councils and legislatures and parliament hide from their constituencies. None of them is there to account. So we need an overall system that changes, and I think enough groups out there are pushing for serious electoral reform. But the problem is we've left it to Parliament. So if you ask a den of thieves to determine the future, how will they determine that future? It's going to be a problem. So we need citizen action to change that system. You cannot have spontaneous resolution of a problem from those responsible for creating it in the first place. And if
absolutely on the point.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Dr. Ramphele, through the lens of Black consciousness, how do we transform this political and electoral system so that it works for the people?
No electoral system, however well designed, will work if the people lack the consciousness of the power they have to make the choices of who should lead. And if you are put there as a leader, they should know that they have the power to remove you if you are deviating from the mandate that they gave you. So what we have in this country is political illiteracy, an unconsciousness amongst the majority of people about the power they have, and political parties have become like piranhas that are just eating away at the soul of this nation. State capture is an example of what happens when you give power to parties, because it doesn't matter who leads that party, the country is powerless. So my point is that the Black consciousness movement showed us that a small group of people with a high level of consciousness was able to mobilize this country to the freedom that we are enjoying today. It was not a liberation movement with guns blazing that came to liberate us. It is liberating the mind and the soul and the bodies of people to say, I have the power to decide how the future should be shaped so that I can lead a life as a dignified human being and be able to enjoy life in abundance. That's what is needed. And we have to make sure, we will have to mobilize to make sure that the school system educates our children about their capacity to make the self-liberating education. That's what we need. Young people who are loitering in the streets, yes, they don't have the skills, but if their minds were liberated, they will be much quicker at learning and being able to do things that would make life different. So the political system of this country, yes, we need to have electoral reform, but without political and just general human consciousness of our power to shape the future we want, no political system is going to help us.
Important point there, Mr. Skeef. This pyramid system that we've got politically with the president at the top and all of us at the bottom, through the lens of Black consciousness, how should it change? Do we need a circle? What would it look like? Your mic?
Yeah. Thank you, my sister. You are sort of preempting me. It's as if you know exactly where I would like to go in my answer. And the first thing is that I do not subscribe to hierarchical social structures. I believe more in a circular level paradigm, such as we formulated, in fact, in our community projects during the Black Consciousness movement. We engaged communities through practical projects like building schools. In fact, it's an alarming revelation that the Salaamedia Community Health Center that was pioneered by Dr. Mamphela, Ramphele, and Steve Biko and others puts the current dispensation to shame. There's nothing that even approximates this manifestation of a vision of a viable health service for our people that focuses on the whole person in keeping with the tradition, again, of African holism. Our political formations should follow similar structures whereby the community has a say in the determination of its future. Top-down formations, for me, are a lie. They're not a true representation of the notion of democracy. We need similar local forms of government where true transparency is more possible and a more responsive system of governance can be implemented. So I opt for a more devolved system of government that will enable more efficient and less convoluted mechanisms of accountability and responsibility in its application. In such a system, the reality of the term by the people aspect of so-called democracy would be closer to the truth. I would like to share with you the fact that the Baka people of the African rainforest, who are offensively referred to as pygmies, are my favorite society, as far as I'm concerned. They do not tolerate up-down, top-down structures simply because, for one, they believe, and rightly so, that for one to get to the top, they must have burdened the others by climbing onto them. So in their society, there's greater equality between women, men, and children than anywhere else in the world. And again, coming back to music, my favorite creative expression, their music is a manifestation of this equality, whereby each person in the community has their own melody, which overlaps with the others' melodies in a perfect cyclical form of polyrhythmic harmony. That is my notion of a better kind of society. And I would hope that, if it were possible for us to engender the kind of outlook that my colleagues are in consonance with me about, we would have a much better society than we have now in South Africa.
Absolutely fascinating. Nyameko, people shall govern. That's always been the ideal, and it's been the vision. We've learned that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So through the lens of Black consciousness, how would you transform this political electoral system so that we have direct democracy?
Okay, what has happened to us post 1994 is that we seem to have forgotten how we, as the liberation movement, did things, how we mobilized, how we enabled communities through the various community programs that have been highlighted already. In my personal world, growing up as a young person in Asheville and Overport in Durban, we had a community center called David Lando. And it was through this center and governance and activity of the communities, things were galvanized. In places like Chatsworth, you had community organizations like Helping Hands. When we finally moved to Newlands West, we had the Newlands West Residents Association. You look into my community today in Johannesburg, in Calvin, and you've got the Calvin Residents Association. Their primary concern of activity is about security and protection. So our local voice is being articulated through community policing forums. We are not looking at the bigger situations, what is the true essence of what our community values need to be articulated or voiced upon. And we ourselves seem to have forgotten how to mobilize. Now, Mamphela and Saths have both articulated something that is imperative, which is we need to get the education, the political education, through our schooling system. And the truth of the matter is, ask 99% of South Africans. We say that we have a great constitution, but what does our constitution say? South Africa is citizenry around its knowledge of its constitution is uninformed, is ill-informed. In actual fact, because it's hearsay through the media. I'm sorry to place it at your door, which is not the responsibility of the media. It's there to support our educational framework. Mamphela, through her organization, started a program at one stage of responsible citizenry. What is a responsible citizen? And we had that in the liberation movement. And through that, the voice can be made heard if all political parties actually start educating our country on its constitution. And therefore, we determine who we are.
Thank you, Nyameko, for that. All right, we are now at 7 o'clock with about 20 minutes to go. And what we're entering into now is a round robin on the views of Steve Biko on various issues affecting our country. What would Steve Biko's views be on how we need to deal with the following critical issues? Perhaps within them, there are clues on why he was assassinated. We're going to have a response of about a minute each from each of our panelists. And we're going to start with corruption and corporate state capture. Prof. Cooper, what would Steve Biko's views be on corruption and corporate state capture, and how we need to deal with it?
Well, first of all, I don't think we would have corruption and state capture if Steve Biko was around. And that's why he had to be killed. He had to be killed because he was on a mission to unite the liberation movement. I mean, we know that. And the narrative has significantly changed. What it has been is a rampant orgy of self-aggrandizement by those people who have claimed falsely, we liberated you. You know, nothing could be further from the truth. And it's about time that we had some agency restored. Now, if we had accountability through a system where people raise their voices, people protest effectively, people organize to ensure that the state responds meaningfully, and hold them constantly accountable, they would not dare do the kinds of things they do. Instead, what they do is they shamelessly do the kinds of things they do, and then parts of the media, especially social media, just flaunts this. I've got so many cars, I've got all these kinds of things, and people think, wow, this is the glister that's going to change my life. Again, it's learned dependency, it's learned ignorance that needs to be outed. We need to get rid of that kind of obtuseness that says, I'm waiting for somebody up there to do these things. As long as we continue waiting, they will continue to rape, rob, and pillage.
On point there. The next issue, racism and fascism. Dr. Ramphele, what would Steve Biko's views be on how we need to deal with racism and fascism?
One of the statements that Steve made was that we in South Africa, if we fully become conscious of what it means to be fully human, we would then be able to attain the kind of freedom, not what we attained in 1994, but the kind of freedom which is freedom of the mind, of the spirit, and freedom to be fully whom God created us to be. And he then said, that is an important step to help give the world a more human face. By doing that, by fully attaining our consciousness as South Africans, as Africans, then Africa, which is the cradle of humanity and civilization, would have again put itself in a position where it will give the world a more humane face. Now, a humane face will not tolerate racism. To be racist means you are in need of completing yourself by denigrating someone else. If you are fully whom you are, you don't need to be racist. You don't need to be sexist. You don't need to be xenophobic. And you don't need to be materialistic. The car doesn't complete you. You are complete as a human being, fully conscious, fully liberated. And then your greatest joy is in being a servant of your fellow human beings, because we know that it is when we are affirming others and being affirmed by others that we are at our best. And that is what our quest for humanity as activists in the Black consciousness movement was about. The fact that that history has been written off, obliterated from the liberation narrative of this country is exactly why racists are rearing their very ugly, proud heads, because they see that we are confused. We are too busy with material things and have forgotten the real price, which is a more human face. That's it.
A more human face. Mr. Skeef, the role of education and the arts, because yes, political education is important. It is equally important as creative education. I think you might agree, but let's hear what you have to say. I believe there was a time where Steve Biko was also very interested in poetry, much like yourself.
Very true indeed. And in that way, Steve was a genius who knew that art is innovation. And one of the key elements of education should be to prepare members of a society to be creative in their solution to the problems they encounter, in their pursuit of making a meaningful contribution to the development of the society they find themselves in. So in our book, Education and the Arts, are inseparable. They're like a dreadlock that ceases to be a dreadlock once you disentangle the threads of the braided hair that constitute it. It's a European absurdity that was imposed on the African mind to regard education as separate from the arts. Again, going back to my point about African holism, a concept that is making a lot of mileage everywhere else in the alternative world except at its African source. By this notion, the dissemination of knowledge is done more ably through the arts than without recourse to them. So the most ancient art form of storytelling, for example, simply inspires a society to know itself and therefore enhance the process whereby it accumulates more knowledge more meaningfully for the purpose of its growth in every imaginable way. Poetry, for instance, dissects reality to provide us with a deeper understanding of how life works. The evolved harmonic exfoliation of piano music elucidates the theories of advanced mathematics. Dance can be used to map out these elucidations for the benefit of every member of society. So in many parts of the world, arts practitioners lead the way in the educational process of making knowledge more accessible, especially those in the community who are intimidated by the way that knowledge is conventionally packaged, or in cases where some form of disadvantage encumbers its attainment. So arts and education very definitely are one whole. They travel together.
Absolutely agree with you. Creativity is indeed one of the highest forms of intelligence. I think Prof. Cooper would agree, having been in plays and in theatre as well. Nyameko, I want to turn the mic over to you now in this round robin that we're doing on Steve Biko's views on certain issues. And the one for you, the first one for you of two, is the role of youth in the economy. What his views? What will his views be? What is the role of youth in our economy?
Well, firstly, number one, in terms of youth in the economy, they are a critical force. And this is epitomized through the Black Consciousness movement. We take a look at June 16th, the fact that it was the youth that led to this statement, political statement, to break down the apartheid system. The youth are critical in the fact that they are our future. Their spirit, their fight, their requirements, without them, we will stagnate to a point. And so even in the more modern times, with regards to fees must fall, again, students have been standing up to talk to the relevance, the importance of their education, and what is needed for themselves, to articulate what is the future that is needed. It's the youth that will articulate that. We, as now I'm part of the older generation, I'm out of the youth cycle. I'm now part of the older framework. We have to ensure that the systems of economy nurture the new vibrant thoughts that will come through them. I mean, Saths, Mamphela, Eugene, they were youth themselves in the formation of the Black consciousness movement. It was that youthful spirit that created this phenomenal philosophy and way of life. And that's what needs to be nurtured. So in terms of the youth, they are an imperative format in our society. We need them to show us and also to highlight some of our mistakes and for them to reaffirm their future for themselves.
Absolutely agree with you. All right, in the second round of round robin, it's a hot one. Prof. Cooper, what would Steve Biko's views be on the land question and farming?
Well, look, I think that it is common cause that we believe that farming is an essential, and we should note that from a net producer of our own food, we've become a serious importer. We were a major exporter in those days. And we had sanctions against the apartheid system. Now we have imported even maize and other staples. That shouldn't happen because we don't have an enabling environment in this country. We caught up in this land question because it's unresolved. I think that if you go back to our documents, you'll find that we affirm that the land is inalienable. It should be utilized for productive purposes. There's nothing wrong in currently saying we should give long-term leases. In fact, in many parts of the country, this is happening. If you look at just beyond where Nirvanen stays, Woodmead and the Mall of Africa is held. People don't own that land. It was given in trust to the mayors, and now they're giving it out on 99-year lease. So they don't own the land, but they own the development on the land. So what is wrong in making that available to more people? If you look at parts of Europe where Eugene is, except for the land, some parts of the landed gentry, the land belongs to the crown and is held by the crown. So what is wrong with that? If it can happen in those parts of the world, why shouldn't it happen here? You know, private ownership of land is actually totally foreign. And when Jan van Riebeeck came here, and when successive groups of immigrants from Europe came here, they found that situation. And you always had contestation because it was totally foreign to have private ownership. So that needs to be restored in that sense, so that people can use the land, because it is a finite commodity. It is what we live on. And if only us can own this, what will happen to future generations? They will be like is happening in parts of Europe, in the West, where people are moving further and further away from their points of work and so on, and unable to access what they should access. So it must be communally owned, it must be held in trust for the benefit of all of the country.
The benefit of all of the country. Last two questions in this round robin before we start rounding up. Last three questions. Dr. Ramphele, what would Steve Biko's views be on how we need to deal with sexism and gender-based violence?
Well, sexism, like racism, as I said earlier on, are a reflection of people who are not fully conscious of who they are as human beings. Because when you are fully conscious and mentally and spiritually liberated, you are not going to oppress somebody else. You're not going to denigrate someone else. And so the fact that we today in South Africa have the worst forms of gender-based violence, it's a reflection of what has gone wrong with our society post-1994. Is this dog-eat-dog? So the men of our society, instead of seeing themselves as partners with women, they are in competition. And because the majority of men, particularly majority of Black men, are unemployed, and their fear is to be dominated or seem to be dominated by women instead of working in collaboration with, in a partnership with. And therefore, sexism is one of the scandals of this society because of our failure to achieve true liberation. And again, it is a problem of not building on what we had succeeded in doing in the Black consciousness movement. We had succeeded in freeing people from this idea that to be a man, you've got to dominate a woman. Because we were Black and proud as men and women, and recognize that we are all better off working in collaboration rather than working in competition. And also, let's understand that women are the vehicle through which new life comes into the world. So we are killing our generative powers by killing women or denigrating women. And so it is actually a societal sickness that we have. But it's not going to be solved by arresting people and putting people in jail. Yes, the law must be applied, but the most important thing, like with racism, is to liberate the minds of people away from the need for them to oppress, to subjugate, and to denigrate.
Women's rights are human rights, and of course our president has called gender-based violence the second pandemic in this country. I would argue that it's actually the first. Mer Grace O'Brien says, as per Komanani Sun, land, water and truth are the only reasons for humans to fight another, because our survival as human beings on earth and ability to thrive depends on access to these three fundamentals. Last two questions in the round robin before we start rounding up today's absolutely brilliant show. Mr. Skeef, an effective TRC. Many of us believe the TRC was not effective, to put it politely. I previously interviewed Ahmed Timon's nephew on the show, talking about the fight and the struggle people to find the truth of what happened to activists who were murdered, where emails and phone calls to the president actually go unanswered. So what we're saying now, do we need a new TRC, but a TJRRC? So truth, justice, reparation, reconciliation commission. So it's not just truth and reconciliation commission. We want justice and we want reparation. What would Steve Biko's views be on that?
I feel not an expert really in answering that question, but in my humble experience, in my memory of the way we operated back then, but also combined with my own personal experience of working in reconciliation around the world through my creative skills, the center of which is music. What is brought to my mind is the glaring need in South Africa for healing, which pulls all those facets together into one. There's a great need for healing. And as I say, in my travels, doing conflict resolution, like I worked in Bosnia, bringing the three, where the term ethnic cleansing was coined, bringing the three factions together, and at Liberian refugee camps and such like. I found that my consciousness was reinforced by a typically African paradigm, which is the circle. The circle as a paradigm is more strongly, there's a greater awareness of it as a unifying and equalizing paradigm in Africa more than anywhere else in the world. So in some senses, we need to go back, if you like. And it's not a going back of a reversal. If you see, if you consider how things work cyclically, like in the universe, the cosmos, you know, our dwellings, the traditional homesteads and what have you, you know, we're not going backwards. When we come to the point where there was rupture, we come to that point even going forward, because we move in cycles and we rediscover that moment. So we need to meditate, we need to stop and gather in a circle, you know, physically, realistically, but also metaphorically, conceptually, to pull ourselves together and be lateral and have everybody in the circle where everybody is equal, and we listen, we discuss. There's not much listening that goes on in the world, you know, what I call creative listening, where we attune ourselves to each other as a community, as an organism, as a whole, and let there be, where we are equidistant from the nucleus, from the kernel, so nobody is superior to anybody else. And we listen and we talk, you know, and we share our wisdoms and knowledge. For me, that is a paradigm that is needed, and that must be in the community more than anywhere else, because during the Black Consciousness movement, we immersed ourselves in the community. We were not removed from the community, you know? So we need to get back into the communities and arrange that we talk with each other and listen. That's my humble answer.
A different perspective on the TRC, and I think we're going to need a whole show on the expansion of that concept: truth, justice, reparation, reconciliation commission. Is that what we need to happen in this country? All right, last question in the round robin for Nyameko. What would Steve Biko's views be on cancelling apartheid debt and multinational ownership of our mines and minerals?
Your microphone.
Yeah, sorry. As Saths said earlier, Steve Biko's last mission, literally before he was brutally murdered, was the unification of the liberation movement. And what that entailed was that all liberators needed to come together to discuss our issues equally and equivalently. And how does this translate back to the question of nationalization, or for that matter, we need as a people to come together to talk about this debt that was created by the apartheid system? Because companies like Sanlam, FNB, Standard Bank, most of these companies and entities like Transnet, Eskom benefited from the monies borrowed that we created this, well, the apartheid regime created this debt with. Now, in order for it to be cancelled, how shall we cancel this out? And the only people that can make this decision are the people of South Africa. Everybody else from around the world needs to be shut out of this conversation, and we need to ensure the safety of South Africans. Most importantly, this will lead back to your earlier question on repatriation. That debt can be substituted by the new land ownership that Saths also alluded to earlier. I think there can be a substitution to the land that has been disposed and moved from us as Black people, and by saying that's the cancellation of the debt. When it comes to the minerals, which is also again around, which ties back into food securities and our production processes of our land and of our people, personally, I feel that, again, we need to talk about it more effectively, because who benefited? How was this privilege created for the employees of Eskom, Transnet, and this was through the profits firstly created by our mines, and more importantly by the debt created. Now, we as a people collectively cannot be responsible for that debt, but we can find, I believe, exciting ways to negate what is due in reparation to the South African people that the wealth of South Africa was created on. And that is in essential way.
Very interesting perspective there from Nyameko. All right, our very last question before we get ready for Eugene Skeef's poem. Looking forward to that one to close us up for this evening's show. And this is the last question. Your thoughts on the power of intersectional solidarity between Black consciousness and global movements like Nigeria's NSAS, the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and Free Palestine. What are your thoughts on the power of intersectional solidarity between Black consciousness and movements like these? Prof. Cooper?
Well, we always had solidarity with the Palestinian cause. And I think that whenever there is an injustice committed anywhere else in the world, and we're not affected by it, given the history of what we've been through, we do ourselves an injustice. It's sad that when the Black Lives Matter campaigns happened years ago, we almost let it slide by. But fortunately, we caught up more recently on this matter. And it also speaks to our essential humanity. You cannot you cannot claim to be human if you ignore human suffering anywhere else. How we treat the worst off amongst us underpins our own claim to being human.
You tremble with indignation at injustice. You are a friend of mine. Che Guevara. Dr. Ramphele, your thoughts on intersectional solidarity between Black consciousness and the movements I've described.
Your mic.
Your mic.
If we reimagine South Africa as a place on a continent which is the mother continent, the mother of not just the cradle of humanity, but the cradle of civilization, then we would have that sense of being connected to people wherever they are who are being oppressed. Because what hurts someone hurts us too. And I like Eugene's issue about healing. These movements are about the healing of the interconnectedness of people. And they are calling for that interdependence of the human race, wherever they are. And an injury to a Palestinian or to a person in the Amazon is an injury to us as a human community. And we cannot have a world that is sustainable if we do not mind what happens to others. COVID is an example of how what happens in a place as far off in China ended up affecting all of us sitting here in Africa or in any other part of the world. We are interconnected, and therefore all injustices have to receive our attention. But we, as South Africans, need to heal ourselves so that we can see ourselves as connected to all people of the world and not have that horror story that you were describing about police beating people up to show them what we South Africans are like. What a disgrace. They
Absolutely.
should be arrested and thrown into the deepest end. We are interconnected, interdependent.
An injury to one is an injury to all. Mr. Skeef, your thoughts on the power of intersectional solidarity between Black consciousness and international movements? Mike.
Volume.
Mic. Your mic.
I'm guilty of it as well. Sorry. No, thank you, Shabnam. I'm saying that, simply put, we share a common enemy, and we are stronger when we are a united front. Ubuntu says we are one as a human race. So Steve would have been motivated for us to link our arms and march together to our collective horizon of freedom. There's no way Steve would not. It's natural that he would have seen that as an obvious outcome. You know, that together we are stronger because, as I say, we share, as everyone else has said, we share a common enemy, and we are fighting as a human race. And your freedom is my freedom. So together we accomplish it.
Our freedom is indivisible. 2 comments before our poem. Siana Naidu says Ronnie Casdalt, in his article that he wrote spoke about the Faustian Pact and the reason that we took these loans and how we were never brave enough to do radical economic transformation. Our freedom was heavily sedated with our hands strapped behind our backs. Powerful comment there from Siana, and I'm sure we all agree with him. And Menzi Kahudu Maseko saying human education against the lies. That's what we need. Sianu Naidu also saying, spot on, Dr. Ramphele. We as a country need to start healing. We need to find trust again. Well, that brings us to the end of the Q&A talking points part of our show this evening. And we're going to close off this evening's show, The People's Voice, with a poem that we are going to be blessed with by Eugene Skeef. I have no idea what poem it's going to be, but I'm certain that we're going to enjoy it very much.
Thank you, Shabnam, my sister. The poem I'm going to read is titled Benediction of the African Child, and I wrote it for African Remembrance Day. It's in a few movements. 1. And the child said, send me the ocean, and I will show you how to replenish the tears of the people who thirst for the ultimate baptism of pain's deluge. And she looked up towards the heavens of our memory, and the fire from her blood-filtered eyes lacerated the darkened skies and tore them asunder with a meridian rupture that cleansed the air of all lingering uncertainties. 2. The particles of memory are invisible. They elude all the human senses, yet infuse them wholly with the essence of the lived moment within the timelines of the soul. And so the child said, if you follow the ribbon of all time, you will eventually find the kite of the human story guided in its flight by the fabric's celestial dance. You will rediscover the genesis of all songs, all dances, all portrayals of the immortal in its journey across the unmeasured millennia. 3. The litanies of all our tribulations are embossed on the symphonic buoyancy of the triumphalism of false intonations passed as truths. Yet no expurgation of our collective memory will perpetually rob us of the rapture of our embedded virtue. For like truncated limbs, we can still feel the extremities of the reach of our original branches, as if the fruits of the severed tree were still in the sap of our throbbing hearts. 4. And from the gallery of resurrected bridges, the chorus of voices rose. African child, you carry within you the seed of the light that our ancestors seek to manifest in our circle. Teach us the anthem for the new world waiting for us to bring to fruition. Remind us that love is the key to the iron gates that imprison the hearts of all who hesitate in the morning of their calling, to sing in the face of the blazing fire of the ever-rising African sun. We look to you to comprehend and learn the choreographic fluorescence of your whirling flourish as a flower in the garden of our people's dreams. For when you open your hands to the light of nature's munificence, it is the infusion of your ka that liberates the flavors of our quest for a truer self. Let us recalibrate our consciousness and fashion our future from the shards of the parched earth. Let us bleed from deep within and restore the dying soil of memory, when the resurrected rivers that we may recast the mold, with the resurrected rivers that we may recast the mold of the African child, according to the inflection of the original resonance of our gathering song. Let us blend the clay from the source and the estuary to reinforce our pliancy with the residual solidity of the burdened tenderness of our blood. Let us step into the surf once more, but with an intention tempered by the wisdom of the seasons of our pain, so that we may ride the waves with new resolve to salvage the sunken spirit of the buoyancy of our collective beat. Let us tender our hearts to the submergence into the inflammable waters of a child's prescience. For all learning rises from the surrender of fear to the depths of a new calling. And in the transmigration of our unregulated consciousness, our signature pelvic pulsations will yield to the revelations of emergent undulations of a newly incisive intellect, where our nascent quest will find a nest to incubate in the preparation for our fledgling flight into our newly claimed height. Let us be the firmament of our own attainment.
A symphony of brilliance there from Eugene Skeef. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you for blessing us with that ode to the African child and our role. I think all of us have enjoyed that very, very much, and we need to be introducing more poetry into our curriculums. Nadia Bulbulia says, wow, deeply moving and beautiful. Huge respect and gratitude to Saths, Mamphele, Nyameko and Eugene. And I've got a comment saying that people want to hear, and I'm going to close it after this, but people want to hear Nyameko's views on that last question. I'm sorry to put you on the spot there, but intersectional solidarity, Nyameko, very quickly.
Oops, sorry. Just from our internal history, from the liberation movement, we had something called SACOS, South African Congress of Sport. Their statement was no normal sport in an abnormal society. So wherever there is abnormality, normal living cannot exist. And so it's our responsibility, it's our accountability to address and unify the protection of the human race. And that stems through from the liberation movement. And it's sad that unfortunately the captain of the South African rugby team says that it's a choice to kneel with regards to Black Lives Matter. No, it's not a choice. That is a must. It is a must for us to stand up wherever injustice happens. We must stand up and fight it. And that is a true South African, a true Azanian, and a true Black consciousness entity, and a freed Black person.
As a free Black person, we must stand up. A massive thank you to our guests this evening for joining us on The People's Voice. What a brilliant conversation it's been. I'm looking forward to watching it all over again. Thank you very much to our guests, Professor Saths Cooper, Dr. Mamphela Ramphele, Eugene Skeef, and Nirvanen Nyameko Moodley for joining us on The People's Voice and for being a voice of the people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you also to our listeners, our viewers, and our Salaamedia team. Remember to ask ourselves every day, what am I doing to make a difference in my community, my country, and my world? Until the next show, revolutionary peace. Assalamu alaikum.